Hello, my name is Henry Silverman, and today in this short presentation I would like to go over the analysis of risk and benefits in clinical research, and more importantly, discuss the value of the concept of the net risk test. Some questions to ask. Must clinical benefits always outweigh the risks? In other words, is it acceptable to expose participants to risk only for the benefit of society? And finally, what are the limits to the levels of risks? Well, the regulations say that in order to approve research, the IRB must identify the risk, minimize those risks, and then the risks need to be justified by the prospect of direct clinical benefit, if any, and the potential social value of the knowledge gained from the research. Now, when we're talking about risks in relationship to clinical benefit, we talk about the risk-benefit ratio, and when we talk about the risks in relationship to the social value of knowledge, we usually talk about the risk-knowledge ratio. When evaluating risk and benefits, the Research Ethics Committee should only consider those risks and benefits that may result from the research, as distinguished from risk and benefits of therapies subjects would receive even if not participating in the research. Now, what is the ethical challenge? Let's start with the question. When is it acceptable to expose individuals to risks in clinical research? The answer: when the subject's participation involves their contributing to a valuable project and the risks are not excessive. The challenge is to develop a systematic framework to make these evaluations. So how do we weigh risks? Well, the IRBs must ensure that the risk and burdens to participants are not excessive and that they are justified by the potential benefit, if any, and the social value of their knowledge. So the question is, how does one calculate the additional risks that come from the research activities? And also, when are risks not excessive? Before we continue, I'd like to go over briefly the concept of net risks. What do we mean when something has a net value? Well, in economic theory, a net value is the resulting amount after accounting for a specific, commonly understood deduction. In clinical medicine, this deduction represents clinical benefit. So, for example, let's say a study includes a biopsy that is done purely for research purposes, and hence there is no compensating potential benefit. Therefore, the net risks represents the risk of the biopsy. In this case, there is no quote-unquote deduction because there is no clinical benefit associated with this biopsy. In contrast, let's say a research study includes an intervention that does offer participants a compensating potential benefit. The net risks of this intervention is zero. Why is that? Well, risk-benefit judgments implicitly rely on some comparison to some baseline. And this baseline is clinical medicine. In clinical medicine, patients accept the risk of procedures as long as such risks are offset by a compensating potential benefit. So one could say that the patients are considering the net risk to be zero. So again, if the risk of an intervention are compensated by a clinical benefit, the net risks are equal to zero. However, if the risks of an intervention exceeds its potential for clinical benefit, we say the net risks are greater than zero. Also, since the benefit has been factored out, in other words, it has been used up, or in other words, used to justify some of the risks of that intervention, then two questions remain. Are the net risks justified by the social value? We say social value because all of the clinical benefit has already been used up, so the only thing left to justify the net risk is the social value of the research. If we think the net risks are justified by the social value, then the remaining question is, are these net risks excessive? So let's go back to risk determination. Now, clinical research studies are composed of different interventions. For example, administration of a drug with a prospect of benefit. It could also include blood draws and brain scans with no prospect of benefit. Or it could consist of a placebo when standard of care exists. It is commonly accepted that IRB should evaluate the risk and benefits of the individual research interventions, and this is known as component analysis. One type of component analysis is called the dual-track risk assessment. This type of assessment categorizes interventions into two distinct categories of risk standards. On one hand, we have therapeutic interventions that offer the prospect of direct benefit, and then we have non-therapeutic interventions which are done for research purposes only. So here's the framework for the dual-track assessment. The first question to ask is the intervention therapeutic? So let's go down the right side of this slide. If the answer is no, then one needs to minimize the risk, and then one asks, are the risks reasonable given the knowledge to be gained? If the answer is no, then the inclusion of this intervention is not acceptable. If the risks of this non-therapeutic intervention is reasonable to the knowledge to be gained, then the inclusion of this intervention is acceptable. Now let's go down the left side of this slide, whereas now we have therapeutic interventions. Now, according to the dual-track assessment, the question to ask, does the intervention satisfy equipoise? If the answer is yes, then the research is acceptable. If, however, there is no equipoise, then the research study is not acceptable. Essentially, one is asking whether the risk-benefit profile of the therapeutic intervention in the research is at least as promising for participants as the established standard of care. Hence, this dual-track view implies that the risk-benefit profile of therapeutic intervention must be at least as favorable as that of the available alternatives in clinical care. If this is correct, then clinical equipoise is an ethical requirement for research involving therapeutic interventions. Now, this dual-track assessment includes two standards. Essentially, on this view, therapeutic interventions are being allowed only when they have a risk-benefit profile that is as favorable to clinical alternatives. In other words, they only allow therapeutic interventions that have a net risk equal to zero. On the other hand, non-therapeutic interventions such as blood draws are allowed even when they have a negative or unfavorable risk-benefit profile. In other words, they would allow non-therapeutic interventions that have a net risk greater than zero. Again, there is no clinical benefit whatsoever, so hence, by definition, the net risk of all non-therapeutic interventions is greater than zero. Again, this dual-track assessment uses two standards. Now, this is a concern with the dual-track assessment. Why the use of two ethical standards? In other words, why can non-therapeutic interventions pose net risks that can be ethically justified? However, therapeutic interventions cannot pose any net risks. Due to the requirement for clinical equipoise, a less than favorable risk-benefit ratio for therapeutic intervention will always be ethically unacceptable. On the other hand, interventions without direct benefit may be ethically acceptable. These concerns may conflate research and clinical care, increasing the potential of the therapeutic conception for participants. So here's the problem. Let's say you have a study that compares a new, expensive, approved treatment to an older, cheaper treatment with more risks. And you want to compare both of these drugs. In this research, a lumbar puncture is being used to measure the response to the infection. In other words, the lumbar puncture is included for research purposes only. According to the dual track analysis, the lumbar puncture is a non-therapeutic procedure and might be probably acceptable if the risk is considered reasonable to the knowledge to be gained. On the other hand, the risk profile of the older drug is not as favorable compared with the new drug, and hence it's not in equipoise, and hence will not be acceptable to the IRB to be approved. Let's consider another problem. Let's say you have a research study to assess merely the pathophysiology of depression, and you expose participants who agree to defer treatments and undergo non-invasive brain scans. Again, non-therapeutic procedures. The IRB may very well determine that the risks of these non-invasive brain scans, while greater than 0, are not excessive. Now, in contrast, these same participants may want to enroll in a placebo-controlled trial in which standard of care treatments are deferred. The dual-track assessment would not allow such a trial because of the requirement of clinical equipoise. In other words, the placebo-controlled trial is not in equipoise with the available clinical alternatives. Now, both of these studies may have similar net risk greater than 0 and similar social value. However, the IRB may improve the study with the non-invasive brain scans, even though the net risks are greater than 0 but not excessive. But on the other hand, in the placebo-controlled trial, the net risks may also not be excessive, but because they represent a therapeutic intervention, the requirement for clinical equipoise would cause the IRB not to approve that study. So in other words, the assumption that clinical equipoise is an ethical requirement for the dual track assessment leads to the use of different standards for the risk of therapeutic and non-therapeutic interventions. So one has to ask, are the net risk of therapeutic interventions more worrisome than the risks of non-therapeutic interventions? Is there a reason to subject therapeutic interventions to a different standard, the standard of clinical equipoise? Well, some people may say that patients receiving treatment interventions should not be knowingly exposed to greater risks than they would be when receiving similar treatments for their condition in the context of medical care. Also, one could ask, is there a reason to expose patients to treatment interventions with a risk-benefit profile that is not as favorable to clinical alternatives? Well, the answer is yes. For example, if you want to do a placebo-controlled trial in which the standard of care is being denied, again, in such a study, the placebo-controlled group is not in clinical equipoise. Also, when one does phase 1 and phase 2 trials and the evidence is not yet determined regarding safety, then the risk-benefit profile is not as favorable as the standard of care. But yet we're doing phase 1 and phase 2 trials. Finally, let's say you want to test an older drug with a less favorable risk-benefit profile of a new expensive drug. In other words, the older drug is cheaper. You may again want to do this, especially in developing countries that doesn't have the budget for the more expensive drug, and now you want to see how much less favorable is the risk-benefit profile of the older but cheaper drug. Now, Wendler and Miller advocate for the net risk testing, thereby using one standard assessment for all types of interventions. Their method is as follows. Identify the net risk for all interventions, and then determine the cumulative net risk. And then the question to ask, are the cumulative net risks excessive given the potential for societal benefit? So let's go over the framework a little bit in more detail. I'm using the same framework of the dual track assessment, and let's see what happens. Now, even though we don't have to divide interventions as to whether they're therapeutic or non-therapeutic, but for the sake of simplicity, let's now ask whether the intervention is therapeutic or not. If the answer is no, then we know right away that the net risk of this intervention is going to be greater than 0. Now we ask, are the net risks reasonable given to the knowledge to be gained? If the answer is no, then we say that these net risks are excessive. If the answer is yes, even though the net risks are greater than 0, since it's reasonable given to the knowledge to be gained, we say that the risks are acceptable. Now, going down the left side of this slide, if the intervention is offering some therapeutic benefit, we could also ask, does the intervention satisfy equipoise? If the answer is yes, we say that the net risk is equal to 0 and hence that intervention is acceptable. If the intervention does not satisfy equipoise, then we say that the net risk is greater than 0. But unlike the dual track assessment, we don't necessarily prohibit the research just because it doesn't satisfy equipoise. Equipoise is being used as a device to determine whether the net risks are equal to 0 or greater than 0. Once we see that the net risks are greater than 0, then we have to ask whether those net risks are reasonable to the knowledge to be gained. If the answer is yes, then that intervention is acceptable. So this alternative concept of Wendler and Miller suggests that equipoise, rather than being an ethical requirement, is merely a useful device for determining whether the net risk of a therapeutic intervention is equal to 0 or greater than 0. So to review, in using the net risk assessment, if the intervention has social value and poses no net risk, it is acceptable. Now, if the intervention posed net risk, regardless of whether the intervention is therapeutic or non-therapeutic, one now adds up all of the net risks, and now one asks, are the cumulative net risks of the study justified by the social value of the study? If yes, then the research is acceptable. If not, then the research is not. So, in the evaluation method of the net risk assessment, one goes through the following steps. First, one ensures and enhances the study's social value. Then one identifies the research interventions. And one does not have to classify these interventions as to whether they're therapeutic or non-therapeutic because there is only one standard being used. One evaluates these interventions and tries to minimize the risk and also to maximize the potential benefits to participants, and then assess whether each of these interventions pose net risks. Then one adds up the cumulative net risk and evaluate whether the remaining cumulative net risks are justified by the study's social value. I hope this presentation was helpful in understanding these concepts. Thank you very much.